By the end of the afternoon, the table was split along its center seam. No one raised their voice. No one stepped forward to argue. Those who had come to watch a contest understood they had witnessed something else instead. The result was clear almost immediately. What remained unclear, then and for years afterward, was how it happened without strain, without visible effort, and without embarrassment to the woman who had come to test him. Witnesses would later agree on only one detail. Bruce Lee never asked for a rematch. The room was not arranged for the ceremony. It was a training space that had learned to tolerate visitors. Bare floors, scarred walls, equipment pushed to the sides when conversation replaced movement. Light entered unevenly through high windows, settling in patches rather than filling the room. Nothing suggested that something memorable was expected to occur. People gathered without urgency. Some were students, some friends, some acquaintances of acquaintances. A few had come because they had heard a name. Others came because they had heard a claim. No one spoke loudly enough to take responsibility for the atmosphere. It formed on its own. At one end of the room stood a heavy wooden table. It had been used before for demonstrations, tests of leverage, tests of will. Its surface carried marks that no one bothered to sand out. The table was not symbolic. It was simply available. The reason for the gathering was understood but not announced. A woman was expected to arrive known within strength circles, not for spectacle but for consistency. Her reputation was not built on stories but on outcomes. Arm wrestling had a way of clarifying such things. Weight classes mattered. Technique mattered. Endurance mattered more. She was larger than most men in the room and accustomed to being measured without courtesy. Bruce Lee was already there. He had not positioned himself at the center. He was not warming up. He moved occasionally, adjusting something small, speaking briefly to someone who asked a question. To anyone unfamiliar with him, he could have been mistaken for an instructor overseeing a routine session. Those who knew him better understood that he rarely refused a test but never pursued one. If something happened in this room, it would not be because he demanded it. It would be because conditions allowed it. As time passed, conversations narrowed. People spoke about weight, about leverage, about how strength presented itself differently in trained bodies. The table remained untouched. No one leaned on it. No one tested it in advance. There was no sense of rivalry yet, only alignment. Two reputations moving toward the same space for different reasons. When the door finally opened, the room did not quiet immediately. The sound of her arrival blended into what was already there. But my posture changed. Attention shifted without instruction. The reason everyone had come was now present. Before she spoke to anyone, people were already speaking about her, not loudly and not in praise. It was more precise than that. Numbers were mentioned, past matches, the way certain opponents had failed not from lack of effort but from fatigue that arrived too early. Someone recalled the thickness of her forearms. Another described how she set her shoulder before a match, as if bracing against something inevitable. She did not interrupt these conversations. She did not need to. Her presence carried enough confirmation to make exaggeration unnecessary. She was broad through the back and shoulders, taller than many in the room, and moved with the economy of someone who had learned not to waste effort where it could not be recovered. Years of competition had shaped her posture. She did not scan the room for attention. She let the room adjust to her. Introductions were brief. She nodded more than she spoke. When asked why she had come, she answered simply that she had heard claims and preferred to see things directly rather than accept them secondhand. There was no challenge in her voice, but there was no softness either. This was how tests were initiated in her world. Bruce Lee watched without signaling that he was watching. He did not step forward when her name was mentioned. He did not offer credentials in return. Those who waited for a verbal exchange noticed its absence and filled it with their own assumptions. Some assumed courtesy, others assumed avoidance. Neither interpretation required his participation. Someone eventually gestured toward the table. Not as an invitation, but as a reference point. The woman followed the gesture with her eyes and gave a short nod, as if acknowledging something already understood. She placed a hand on the surface briefly, testing nothing, only registering its presence. Bruce Lee remained where he was. When their eyes met, there was no assessment visible on his face. No smile, no resistance, only recognition, as if he understood exactly what kind of question she had come to ask, and exactly how little needed to be said in response. The room settled into a quieter attention. Reputation had done its work. The rest would not require explanation. The question was never phrased directly. It took shape through glances, through the way people stopped repositioning themselves and began standing where they were. Someone mentioned arm wrestling as if recalling an unrelated detail. Another responded with a half-smile that did not deny the suggestion. No one asked Bruce Lee if he was willing. No one asked the woman if she was ready. The assumptions were made quietly, and once made, they became difficult to undo. She removed a jacket and folded it over a chair. The movement was unhurried, deliberate. It was not a gesture of performance. It was preparation in its most ordinary form. Those who watched recognized it as such and adjusted their expectations accordingly. This was not going to be a novelty. It was going to be measured. Bruce Lee approached the table without ceremony. There was a brief exchange, a few words not remembered clearly afterward. Witnesses would later disagree on what was said, which suggested it was not important. What mattered was the tone. There was no friction in it, no attempt to establish dominance through speech. If there was an imbalance, it was not acknowledged out loud. Hands were placed on the table. Elbows found their positions naturally, as if guided by habit rather than instruction. Someone suggested rules, then stopped midway through the sentence, realizing there was nothing to clarify. Both participants already understood the structure of the test. The woman's arm was thick through the forearm, the wrist stable and practiced. This was where she worked. This was where most opponents began to hesitate. Bruce Lee's hand looked smaller by comparison. His grip did not announce itself. He did not roll his shoulder or set his stance in any visible way. There was no visible tightening, no preparation meant to be noticed. Observers began to sense that the question itself was uneven, not because of size, not because of gender, but because the room had assumed the test would be about force, when one of the participants had not arrived to discuss force at all. Someone counted down without being asked to. The moment arrived without emphasis, and in that moment, the nature of the question began to change. There was no clear signal that the match had begun. No sharp intake of breath, no tightening of the room. Those closest to the table later said it felt as though the moment simply slid forward, uninterrupted, from stillness into motion. Bruce Lee's hand did not surge. It did not twist or snap into position.
If there was a change, it was subtle enough to escape immediate notice.
His posture remained unchanged, his shoulder relaxed, his expression neutral. From a distance it appeared as though nothing decisive was happening at all. The woman applied pressure the way she always did, gradually, methodically, allowing her strength to establish control before committing fully. This was how she avoided mistakes. This was how she had learned to win. For a brief instant the table held, then something shifted. Not outwardly, not in a way that invited reaction. It was felt rather than seen, a sudden loss of alignment, a quiet failure of resistance where resistance had always answered before. The woman's wrist did not collapse, her arm did not shake. Instead, the pressure she expected to meet simply wasn't there in the way she understood it. Witnesses struggled later to describe what happened next. Some said the movement was downward, others said it was inward. A few insisted the arm never moved much at all. What they agreed on was this: the result was decided almost immediately. The sound came after. A sharp, dry crack ran through the room as the table split along a stress seam that had not been meant to bear that kind of load. The wood did not explode. It failed. Cleanly final. The woman released her grip at the same moment Bruce Lee did. There was no follow-through, no attempt to press the outcome further. The match ended without anyone needing to say so. For a second, no one spoke. Bruce Lee straightened, stepping back from the table as if nothing unusual had occurred. He did not look at the break. He did not look at the people watching. His attention returned to neutral space. The woman remained seated, her hand still resting where the table had been intact moments before. She looked down not at her arm but at the split wood beneath it. She did not ask to try again. The moment had passed, leaving no spectacle behind, only a result that refused to explain itself. The silence that followed was not confusion, it was a recalibration. People leaned closer to the table, not to inspect the break for damage, but to confirm that it was real. The wood had separated cleanly, the fracture running along a line of stress that now seemed obvious in hindsight. What unsettled the observers was not that the table had failed, but that it had failed without warning. The woman withdrew her arm slowly. There was no sign of pain, no shaking in her hand. She flexed her fingers once, as if checking for sensation, then rested her palm against her thigh. Her breathing remained steady. Whatever had happened had not overwhelmed her physically. It had displaced something else. She looked toward Bruce Lee, then away again, as though searching for a familiar explanation and finding none that fit. In competition, defeat usually arrived with clear markers: loss of position, loss of leverage, loss of endurance. This moment had offered none of those. The structure she relied on to measure outcome had gone quiet. Someone murmured that the table must have been weakened. Another suggested the angle had been wrong. The words did not travel far. They dissolved before becoming useful. No one challenged the result. No one tried to reframe it as an accident or coincidence with any conviction. Bruce Lee did not address the room. He did not offer context. He did not explain what he had done or why it had worked. His calm remained intact, not as indifference, but as completion. For him, there was nothing left to resolve. The woman stood and adjusted her jacket over one shoulder. She did not laugh it off. She did not mask the moment with humor. She nodded once in his direction, a gesture that carried neither concession nor pride. It was recognition, plain and unadorned. Those who saw it understood that she would not speak of this as a loss. It was something else. As she moved toward the door, the room slowly regained sound. The chairs shifted. Someone exhaled more audibly than before. The language of strength, numbers, claims, comparisons, returned, but it felt less certain now, as if the vocabulary had been temporarily interrupted. The table remained broken, and in that break, the room had learned something it would not be able to phrase cleanly afterward. No one rushed to fix the table. It stayed where it was, split and uneven, as though moving it too quickly would disturb whatever had just settled into the room. People stepped around it with care, not because it was dangerous, but because it now marked a boundary. Before and after. Bruce Lee had already turned away. He did not linger to receive acknowledgement. He did not wait for questions. He spoke briefly to someone near the wall about an unrelated matter, then gathered his things with the same economy he always used. To those watching, it was unclear whether he intended to leave or simply resume the ordinary rhythm of the space. The distinction seemed unimportant. A few people tried to reconstruct the moment aloud. They gestured toward the angle of the arm, the height of the elbow, the position of the wrist. Their hands traced invisible lines in the air, searching for a mechanical explanation that would restore balance to what they had witnessed. The gestures grew smaller as the theories lost confidence. Someone suggested a rematch might clarify things. The suggestion did not reach either participant. The woman paused at the doorway, turned once more toward the room, and let her gaze settle briefly on the broken table. She did not touch it again. She did not claim it as evidence or excuse. She simply noted it, as one notes a fact that no longer requires interpretation. Bruce Lee did not look back. In the days that followed, the table was removed, replaced with another similar in shape and weight. The space returned to its usual function. Training continued. Voices rose and fell. Nothing in the routine appeared altered, but the room had changed. Those who had been present found themselves quieter when speaking of strength, not cautious, precise. They noticed alignment more, timing, the absence of effort where effort had once seemed unavoidable. The demonstration had not introduced a new technique. It removed a misunderstanding. Bruce Lee never referenced the incident. When asked about it later, he redirected the conversation or answered in terms so generally they offered no foothold for analysis. The absence of explanation became part of the memory. Not evasive, intentional. The table was gone. What remained was harder to point to and more difficult to set aside. The story did not settle into a single version. In the years that followed, it resurfaced in fragments, told quietly, usually after a pause, usually to someone who had asked a different question. Those who had been in the room struggled to keep their accounts consistent, not because memory failed them, but because the event resisted compression. Each retelling circled the same outcome and arrived there by a slightly different path.
Some emphasized the woman's size.
Others minimized it. Some focused on the table, describing the sound it made, the way the break looked too clean to be dramatic. A few insisted the movement had been almost invisible, while others admitted they had looked away at the wrong moment and only understood what had happened by the silence that followed. What no one could offer was a technique. There was no grip to copy, no leverage point that could be demonstrated afterward. Those who tried to reenact it found themselves exaggerating, adding force where none had been visible, introducing effort that had not been present. The more they explained, the further the explanation drifted from the original moment. Bruce Lee never corrected them. By then, he had moved on to other spaces, other conversations, other challenges that were not framed as challenges at all. He continued to teach, to train, to refine ideas that would later be written down and interpreted by others with varying degrees of accuracy. The incident did not appear in his notes. It did not need to. The woman, when asked about it years later, did not describe it as a defeat. She spoke instead about misjudgment. Not of him, but of the question she had brought with her that day. Strength, she said once, had more than one dimension. Then she changed the subject. The table became a detail people remembered when they wanted something concrete. Wood breaking was easier to hold on to than silence. But even that detail began to blur with time. Some claimed the table had been reinforced. Others said it had already been weakened. The facts shifted, but the meaning remained oddly stable. Those who had been present understood why the story endured. It was not because someone had won, it was because something had been shown, briefly and without insistence, and then allowed to disappear. No lesson was announced, no authority was claimed. The demonstration was complete the moment it ended, and its influence traveled slowly, changing shape as it went. Years later, when the story was told again, it was usually followed by a pause, not for emphasis, for recognition. And then the conversation moved on, leaving the listener with a sense that something important had passed through the room once, quietly, and had never needed to return.